Now that we have ended up on the last setting, which is the ISO, think of ISO as an internal light in your camera. It is artificial light that is added to your image to brighten it. ISO is measured by hundreds. 100 is the lowest and is the neutral setting when you are taking photos during a bright day. As you get into a darker environment and setting, you will need to increase it by the 100th to brighten up your photo. It is almost like a dimmable light in your camera. As you increase it, you're forcing light into a space that does not exist. What I want you to do now is try to identify your lowest and highest ISO on your camera. When you find it, take note that the smaller the number, the less light you are putting into your camera, and the higher the number, the more light you are putting in. In my camera, the lowest I can go is 100, and the highest is 25,600. Well, the next question is, if it adds light into my camera, why do I need to worry about the correct light setting? The fact is that there is a downside of increasing your ISO. Your photo will become grainy, and it depends on the camera body that you have. The better the camera, the better the capacity of the camera's ISO. Nevertheless, you want it to remain the lowest possible. The last thing I usually like setting up is the ISO. After I have adjusted the aperture and the shutter speed, I want it to be almost like the last resort if I don't have enough light. Now that you have understood these settings, what is important is that when you are taking your photos, using the manual settings, you will apply all three settings together to create your photo. As I've mentioned, it's almost like an equation to create good lighting. To help you figure out whether or not you have balanced lighting, you are going to be using the manual setting, and you will have to be adjusting the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all on your own. You will need to make sure that the photo quality is at a good exposure. But how do you make sure that your photos are at a good exposure? This is where we introduce the exposure meter. You can find the exposure meter in your camera. It looks like a white line, and there are about 6 numbers on it, starting with -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. This will tell you if your photo is overexposed or underexposed, which means that there's too much light or there's too little. You always want it to remain balanced and relatively near 0. Nothing over, nothing under. You're going to try to find the exposure meter on your camera, pointing your camera at a certain area in your room. And see where the exposure meter is at on your manual setting. Then try to toggle it. Try to toggle your aperture, shutter, and ISO so that it meets in the center. Have you ever experienced taking photos and the person becomes too blue or yellow? Usually this is caused by the environment that you're taking your picture in. White balance is a setting on your camera that adjusts the color temperature of your environment to make it neutral. Depending on your camera will offer various white balance settings, starting with AWB, which means automatic white balance. What I want you to try to do is to identify where the white balance is and test it out by trying all different settings on your camera and to see which white balance setting is the best. And that wraps up our understanding of ISO, exposure meter, and white balance.